So this video is going to cover life in the two major superpower blocks, the East and the West, and how they were different and how they reacted to a lot of the challenges during the Cold War. And we're going to start with the West and Japan because they're so closely aligned with each other. So interdependent is our first vocab word, and this is where countries rely on each other for different materials, goods, education, whatever. They're all interdependent on each other. And this is going to be really important in the democratic world where a lot of the countries begin like this interdependent world order. Welfare state is a country where the government takes a lot of responsibility for its citizens, rather it's healthcare or food or increasing like jobs for people. And then the European Union, this is going to be one that you have to understand all the way to the end of the year. The European Union is an organization in Europe where all the countries of Europe kind of work together. It's not like a country, but it's more like just a organization, kind of like an alliance. Obviously, when talking about the Cold War, we're going to start with the major superpower of the day, which is the United States. So post-World War II, United States is superpower numero uno. The United States is the most powerful country on the planet, mostly because of the atomic bomb, but also the United States during World War II wasn't that affected by the war. Our nation was never invaded. Our cities weren't bombed. So the U.S. was very well off. 50% of all goods are going to be made in the United States at the end of World War II. That's huge because the U.S. is going to be the one selling the supplies to rebuild the planet, and that's going to cause a lot of money to funnel back into the United States. The United States focuses almost exclusively on the creation of consumer goods. Consumer goods are things like cars, vacuum machines, dryers, washers, microwaves, toys for kids, that kind of stuff. And that leads to a lot of prosperity amongst the middle class and a growing in the middle class because the economy is based on buying and selling things, and it allows people to start businesses. The baby boom is another big thing after World War II. People come home from the war, they start having children. When children are born, that causes the economy to grow because there's more products out there, and the U.S. continues to grow. The U.S. has an extremely high standard of living. Keyword there is extreme. The average American family had a lot more disposable income than anybody else across the planet. And you can kind of see that in the 50s with the growth of cars in the suburbs. The main U.S. political goal, though, is to create an interdependent world economy. The United States' idea is that if everybody works together and everybody is trading with each other, that will prevent another world war. But the U.S. is going to be number one in that interdependent economy. We're going to lead it, and the U.S. is going to kind of be on top of that. You can see that the U.S. continued to spend a lot on its military to kind of stay in control of the world and protect its interests during this time period in the 90s and up into the 2000s. We're spending more than any other country on our military. The 1950s and the 1940s, right after the war, are a huge transformation period for the United States. It's where the United States goes from kind of its agricultural nation to the modern suburban industrial nation we know today. The suburbs grow, and this is because of the increased wealth and cars. People can leave the city, they can move out to the suburbs, get their little plot of land, their house. The interstate highway system connects America together very easily. It was originally created by President Eisenhower as a way for the military to move quickly from coast to coast, but it became very important because it allowed the United States to open up its suburbs and open up other areas to work. One of the bad things that happens, though, is because people are moving to the suburbs, the inner cities begin to decay. American cities during the 1960s and 70s actually become very dangerous places because the people who pay taxes are moving out to the suburbs, which means that the cities can't provide for themselves anymore. You can see just the urban decay here, what happens to some of the cities. I think these two are New York in the 1970s, and then, of course, you have Detroit and the famous decay of Detroit up in Michigan. The United States also goes through a lot of social transformation. In the 1950s and 60s, the civil rights movement begins, probably one of the most important social transformations since the Civil War. Fights discrimination, segregation all over the country, morphs into the modern movements of today a little bit. Martin Luther King, we all know, emerges as the main leader. I don't go over this too much because you get a ton of it in U.S. history, but just to kind of give you a basic overview of what was changing in the United States. In Not just African Americans were campaigning for rights. Women, Latinos, Native Americans were also campaigning for a lot of rights and equal representation in society. And this would lead Congress to go on to pass laws like defending voting rights of all citizens, making sure there was access to housing and jobs, and banning discrimination based on race and gender in workplaces and public areas. And this is it's a good thing in U.S. history, but during this time period in the 60s and 70s, it creates a lot of conflict in American society, and it causes a real reflection of what America is for a lot of people. We'll talk a little bit about Western Europe next, because this is going to fall more under the Western Bloc in the hold of the United States. So Germany is obviously a major part of the post-war world, and West Germany is the capitalist area. West Germany is under control of the Western Allies, and it goes through what's called the economic miracle. You can see from these two pictures, this is West Germany right after the war. This is West Germany a few years later. Yes, it's still rough. Yes, the city is still kind of a mess, but you can see it's quickly being rebuilt from the devastation of World War II. It becomes a member of NATO so that it can defend itself from the Soviet Union, and they create a welfare state to begin to kind of care for the citizens and also begin that denazification process. This video just explains the Berlin Wall a little bit, which is going to be a major piece of the post-World War II Cold War era. Britain had a major change to its empire during the post-World War II years. So Britain relinquished its global leadership to the United States. The United States kind of took over as the defender of democracy. Mainly because it just couldn't afford its overseas colonies. World War II had literally broken the back of the British Empire. And you can see that through these two maps in the bottom right and left, that they just gave up their colonies. They had to. They were forced to do that over these years. Britain had a few rough years all the way up into the 1980s when their economy went into recession, but slowly the British economy has recovered, and in the modern day, Britain has begun to be a major force again in the world stage. France, Netherlands, Belgium, who had all been conquered by Germany, kind of have the same story. They were all forced to give up their overseas colonies, either through war, like with the French in Vietnam over here, or with the Belgians having to give up their Belgian Congo colony because it was too expensive. And eventually they do rebuild their economies, but they definitely have a less of an impact on the world stage, and they weren't these globe-spanning empires anymore. And then finally, we have Japan. Japan was very interesting because it totally changed its whole society due to World War II. Japan was occupied by the United States, and they also had an economic miracle driven by a new capitalist economy. But the main thing that happens to Japan is they create a new constitution. They totally change their government and society. The armed forces of Japan is disbanded and banned. Japan is not allowed to have an offensive military. They were so ashamed of World War II, they gave up their military. They became a democracy, even though they kept the emperor. They embraced democracy, and the emperor stayed as kind of a figurehead. And Japan gave up war. Japan legally cannot declare war, and the United States is who defends Japan. It's kind of a reckoning for what happened during World War II and a remembrance of all the destruction that the Japanese people had caused. Japan very quickly transforms, though, and then the occupation by the United States ends in 1952, and U.S. troops leave Japan, but their economic growth causes them to become a major player over in East Asia. Japan and the United States continue to work as close allies because Japan falls under what's called the nuclear umbrella. So an umbrella protects you from the rain, and the idea is that the United States protects Japan with its nuclear weapons. If anybody messes with Japan, the United States comes to Japan's protection. So we have a lot of military bases over in Japan, and we kind of act as Japan's army. This is kind of a benefit for both the United States and Japan because Japan doesn't have to actually have an army, but the United States gets those bases over in Asia so it can respond to threats very quickly. And next we have the Eastern Bloc, made up of the Soviets and all their kind of allies and satellite states. So the Soviet Union is superpower number 2 in the world. They're equal to the United States in some ways, below the United States in others. Overall, the Soviet Union had a lot lower standard of living than the United States. The people didn't have as many consumer goods, but they had a lot of social programs. Because the Soviet Union was socialist, their social welfare state was far superior to the United States. There was free healthcare, there was free schooling, there was free childcare, but all of it was at a lower quality than what could be gained at the United States. There's a lot less goods and services because the Soviet Union focuses on heavy industry and science. They focus on building things like tractors, tanks, locomotives, steel. They focus on, things like sending men into space and healthcare instead of focusing on things like cars and microwaves and radios. The goal of the Soviet Union is directly opposed to the United States. While the United States wants to spread capitalism and create an independent economy, the Soviet Union wants to spread communism and their command economy. After World War II, the Soviet Union goes through 3 distinct eras that kind of lead to its breakup. So first is the Stalin era, and this is what we learned about in Topic 8. It's that totalitarian police state. There's no freedom, constant surveillance. Stalin begins to be more and more and more kind of paranoid, but there is massive growth after World War II. And this is because Stalin takes things from Germany and the conquered territories in the East, ships them back to the Soviet Union, and uses them to regrow the Soviet Union's economy at the expense of Eastern Europe. That's why he wanted those satellite states. After Stalin dies, the Khrushchev era takes over when Nikita Khrushchev becomes the premier of the Soviet Union, and he starts a process of de-Stalinization. His idea is that Stalin was bad for the Soviet Union, so he denounces him publicly, and he kind of opens up the Soviet Union a little bit. Not too much. It's not like you have total freedom, but people are allowed to do some things, they're allowed to travel a little more, but the Communist Party is still very firmly in control of the Soviet Union. He reformed the economy, and instead of a focus on heavy industry, it's a focus on consumer goods. And this whole point is so the Soviet Union can compete with the West. So people begin to have more things that they can buy for their home. There's more homes built in the Soviet Union. There's more cars built in the Soviet Union. And he focuses on actually coexisting with the West. Khrushchev didn't see the competition with the United States as like a winner-take-all thing. He thought that both the Soviet Union and the United States could survive. They would just have their separate spheres of influence. After Khrushchev, you have what's called the stagnation era, and it's led by several Soviet presidents, but the biggest one is Leonid Brezhnev. And this is just where the Soviet Union stops growing. They roll back a lot of the reforms of the Khrushchev era. They go back to making heavy industry instead of the consumer goods. They return to censorship, and it causes a growing discontent in the Soviet Union. It causes more and more problems, and the Soviet Union continues to fall more and more and more behind the United States until it's almost impossible for it to catch up. One of the most important things to include when talking about the Soviet Union, though, is the satellite nations. So the satellite nations consist of the nations in Eastern Europe that were taken by the Soviet Union after World War II. And though these nations are independent, they're pretty much controlled by the Soviet Union. They're called satellites because a satellite, it orbits something and it's controlled by the gravity of another body in space. So they're all communist governments, and the whole point of them is a buffer zone between the Soviet Union and the West. The Soviets had been invaded twice, and what they wanted was countries in between them and the West, so if an invasion came from the West, they could see it coming, and to keep the democratic and capitalist ideas out of the Soviet Union. The life in the satellites is very, very similar to life in the rest of the Soviet Union. The standard of living is low. It's even lower than the Soviet Union. There's no political freedom. The Communist Party is literally the only Communist Party, and almost everything is censored. It's not to say that life is bad. It's just a lower standard of living than the rest of the Western European world. One of the examples is East Germany. So East Germany was split after World War II, and you had West Germany, which is our capitalist side, and then you have East Germany, which is our communist side. And Berlin was also split between the two. East Germany's communist. It had a very stagnated economy. The Soviet Union pretty much just used the country as a bargaining chip and a way to exploit the German economy to rebuild the Soviet Union. But it does have that welfare state. There's low unemployment and most people's needs are met. You can see from this picture down here in the bottom right, though, it's just not as vibrant as West Germany. There's fewer cars. All the cars are the same model. It's kind of dirty and hazy. And that's kind of what the satellite states are like. That's not to say that the USSR didn't face issues. So just like the United States had a time of social upheaval with the civil rights movement and a lot of the other movements in the US, Soviet Union faces the same thing. They faced the Hungarian and the Czechoslovakian kind of revolts. Hungary, in 1956, there began to be protests against the Soviets still occupying their country. So the people withdraw from the Warsaw Pact. They want the Soviets out. The Soviets used the Warsaw Pact to invade, and they put down the rebellion. And this is kind of going to characterize the Soviet Union, that you don't have the option to leave the Soviet Union. If you try and leave, the Soviet troops are going to invade you, and they're going to maintain control of those satellites. About 10 years later, the Czechs tried the same thing. One of their leaders was reforming. He was still communist, but he was like a modern liberal communist. The hard-line communists opposed him. Warsaw Pact troops invade Czechoslovakia. They restore true communism, and the Iron Curtain remains intact. So I hope this makes sense of just what life was like and kind of the different blocks, the power blocks that existed during the Cold War. And if you have any questions, just let me know.